Hello, Accelerated Math 7-8 students. We are going to be starting video number 13, and it is called Using the Identity and Inverse to Write Equivalent Expressions, and it is found on page 32 in my comp book. Here's page 32, so here we go. Using the identity and inverse to write equivalent expressions. Today we will revisit the identity properties of 0 and 1 and the use of inverses to write equivalent expressions. So our question that I need you to be thinking about today is, what happens to the expression when you multiply it by a -1? What happens to an expression when you multiply it by a -1? Okay, so the first thing I want to go over, I can't remember if we've ever formally talked about the additive identity property of 0, but if we haven't, we're going to do it today. So the additive identity property of 0 is when you take any number and you add its opposite, it gives you 0 as the answer. So for example, if we have 2 minus 2, you're going to remember the rule that subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. So you're going to take 2, change this to a plus, change this to its opposite. So 2 becomes -2. So now we have 2 plus a -2. And when you have 2 plus a -2, you get an answer of 0. Okay? Let's try another one. You have -4 minus a -4. Remember, subtraction is the same thing as adding the opposite, so we would change this to a plus, and we change this to its opposite. So -4 plus 4 gives me 0. So the additive identity property of 0 is whenever you take a number and add it to its opposite, you will get a 0. Okay, let's try this one. The difference of 5 and 5. So if you write that as an expression, 5 minus 5, because that's the difference of 5 and 5. Remember that subtraction is the same thing as adding the opposite. So we have change that to add, change that to the opposite. So 5 plus a -5 gives me 0. Last one, if you have G minus G, subtraction is the same thing as adding the opposite. So that becomes a plus and that becomes a -G. So G plus a -G gives you 0. So are you starting to see a pattern yet? We've done 4 different examples of this. So the thing that I need you to take away for the additive identity property of 0 is the sum of a number and its inverse is equal to 0. The sum, that means you're adding things together, a number and its inverse is a fancy word for opposite, is equal to 0. So the sum of a number and its opposite is equal to 0. That's what the additive identity property of 0 is. Okay? So that's adding 0, or adding opposite numbers and getting 0. Okay? Now we're going to talk about the multiplicative identity property of 1. Hopefully you can get an idea of what we're coming up with. So on the multiplicative identity property of 1, you're trying to find a product of 1 at the end. We were trying to find a sum of 0 with this one. Now we're looking for a product of 1. So if you take 3/4 and you divide it by 3/4, if you remember that dividing is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal, then this will work. So we have 3/4 divided by 3/4. We remember that division is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. Multiplying by the reciprocal of 3/4 is 4/3. So we would take 3/4 times 4/3. We would get equals 12/12, which equals 1. So did we get a product of 1? The answer is yes. Okay, let's try this one. If we have 4 divided by 4, we remember that division is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So change it to multiply. The reciprocal of 4 is 1/4. So you have 4 over 1 times 1/4 gives you 4/4, which is equal to 1. Okay, let's try another one. What if you have 1/9 divided by 1/9? Well, remember that division is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. The reciprocal of 1/9 is 9, so 1/9 times 9 gives you 9/9, which equals 1. Okay, one more. Negative 1/3 divided by negative 1/3. Division is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So we have negative 1/3 becomes negative 3. Notice the sign doesn't change, just the reciprocal of the actual numerical values. So negative 1/3 times negative 3 over 1 gives you a negative divided by a negative, which gives you a positive, or a negative times a negative, which gives you a positive. So 3 divided by 3 equals 1. Okay? Does everybody see what we're trying to get when you get a product of 1? Okay, so the rule for this one is, so the product of a number and its multiplicative inverse, or reciprocal, is equal to 1. So inverse in this manner was reciprocal. Inverse in this manner is opposite. Okay? When it's adding, it's called an opposite. When it's multiplying, it's called a reciprocal. Okay? So now I want you to try some. Okay, let's see. I think that's it. Yeah, so the ones that I want you to try are here, and I'm sorry, I kind of ran out of room, but the two I want you to try are the opposite of 5x minus 1 and 5x. So your job is to write the expression. So the opposite means that it's negative. Of means times. 5x minus 1 is an expression, and means plus, and 5x is an expression. So when we write that in an expression form, we have a negative times the quantity 5x minus 1 quantity plus 5x. So your job is to simplify that out for me. Okay? The reciprocal of 3 and negative 6y minus x. So the reciprocal of 3 is 1/3, right? And means plus, and negative 6y minus 3x is an expression. So we would have 1/3 plus a negative 6y plus, or minus 3x. Okay, so we'd have this. I'm going to put this inside of here so we don't get confused by that. Okay? All right, so you're going to try simplifying those down into the smallest form you can. And you can remember that you can apply the multiplicative identity property of 1, or you can use the additive identity property of 0, which one would ever make you happier. Okay? Give it a try, and we'll talk about them when you get to class tomorrow. The question that I needed you to think about is, what happens to an expression when you multiply it by a negative 1? Interesting. I wonder what happens when you multiply everything by a negative 1. Hopefully you can tell me tomorrow. All right, that's all, my dears. Have a good one. Bye.